Okay, we have 127 times during this meeting referred to the Biodiversity Council, and we've said that Karsten is a member, but now we've got the chairperson, Signe Norman, who's a professor at the University of Aarhus, who has taken time out of her busy schedule to come and really tell us. So often we talk about things we know nothing about. It seemed like a good time to actually change that and learn something. So thank you very much, Signe, for coming and helping us better understand, because this is the idea is, other countries might want to copy. What's the good and what's bad?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you hear me okay. So I have been given the difficult task of actually explaining what is the Biodiversity Council, but also what we are doing. So I can say in advance, I have a little bit too many slides, so I will start slow. There will be a little bit of speedy in the middle, and then I will try to end slow. So what is the Biodiversity Council? The Biodiversity Council basically exists of 9 researchers from all across the country. And the council was elected by the directors of all universities were proposing who could be the members of the Biodiversity Council to the ministry, the environmental ministry, and then the environmental ministry elected the members of the council. And the council is special in a way that it covers all ecosystems. So we have 3 that is responsible for biodiversity on land, the 3 in the top. We have 1 with focus on biodiversity in freshwater and lakes, 2 that knows a lot about biodiversity in marine ecosystems, and then we have 3 members that represent either law, economy, or recreational use or participatory research. So we cover this breadth of science, and as basic principle of everything what we are doing, it is consensus statements. So we obviously spend quite some time on discussing where do we agree and where do we disagree. And I can say as sort of a key message to everyone starting this, you need to plan in some time of understanding each other, because it takes some time to actually speak the same language across the ecosystem, even though that it's just we talk about biodiversity, but we talk about it in different ways. So the Danish Biodiversity Council, it was decided that Denmark should have this council in the end of 2020. It was a political decision. The members were selected in the end of 21. And then we were basically have established and produced reports in 22 until today with increasing frequency. I have some of the reports over here if someone is interested in more details. But we also decided to establish a dialogue forum for biodiversity, which consists of more than 35 organizations all across Denmark, both the ministries, but also different NGOs and other organizations covering basically all the people that might be interested in knowing what we are doing, but also can basically help us understand what are the barriers, what are the potentials when all what we are recommending should be implemented. And each time we come out with a report, they have the opportunity to comment on our reports, and then their statements is also made public. And we spend some time in trying to integrate in all that knowledge. But what is our key role and task? Basically, we are providing science-based and independent political advice. So we are advising the parliament and the government and basically the public on how can Denmark revert the loss of biodiversity. And there's, of course, some official documents of what is our key tasks. It's related to this, and then we have to try to implement international policies. What does that mean for Denmark? But overall, you can say sort of a little bit summarizing is that we need to provide what is actually the status of biodiversity, what is the status of protection, restoration, and other means of conservation. How effective are they? What we are doing in Denmark today, can it be done better? Are the current efforts sufficient to actually avert the loss and make a difference for biodiversity? And just sort of thinking of going ahead, what are basically the key means that is needed to solve this crisis? How should we prioritize them? What and where should they be prioritized? And then, of course, we can come with a lot of advice, but we also need to try to come with advice on how do we then assure an effective implementation of this advice. So what I want to try to do today is basically say a little bit about how we work, but then give you some example of the types of work we have been doing. And then afterwards, you're welcome to ask a lot of other questions of how we are organized. We meet several times a year with the ministries and present the works and have, of course, regular meetings. So the way we work is basically standard scientifically. We synthesize existing knowledge. We do our own analysis. And that is some of the examples I want to provide for you today. So in our first report, we looked into how good are Denmark doing in sort of stopping the loss of biodiversity. And there have been previous work done in Denmark looking at 171 indicators for biodiversity for species, habitats, and processes that have looked into to which degree is actually the conditions sufficient for these indicators, and is the loss reverted or stable. So are we in this realm or are we down here? So it might be increasing a little bit, but the conditions for biodiversity in the long term is really far from sufficient. And the conclusion is that the loss have been stopped for about 1% of all these indicators. It hasn't been stopped for almost half. And then there's a lot of these we don't know. Maybe we can measure that there's an increase or it's stable, but we very often don't know actually the status. So we know that it's the conditions for biodiversity in Denmark it's poor. We are on a very low level in general, but we also know what it takes to revert the loss. And I'm sure Carsten have said this yesterday, but we know what it takes because we know that we need much bigger areas. We know that they need to have a much better quality, and we know that they need to be protected. And we do that because biodiversity needs space, quality, and time. Because with that, we can have ecological integrity. We have much more robust and functional ecosystem. Another key principle of the work that we are sort of underlying all the work we're doing in the Biodiversity Council is that we're not focused on individual species or only rare species. We try to do recommendation for multiple facets of biodiversity, the unique, the functional, basically covering a broad aspects of ecosystem and biodiversity. So if we just sort of focus into what does it then basically, what have we then tried to recommend in terms of quality? We have developed a catalog of the means that needs to be implemented, can contribute to reverting the loss. But overall, in terms of improving quality, it's about restoring natural ecological processes. It's water dynamics, it's natural grazing dynamics, it's vegetation dynamics, assuring the transition from open land to forest. In Denmark, we have very clear boundaries in our legislation of when is it forest, when is it open land, and that affects management. It's about reducing pressures on nature in general, nutrients in particular, and stop for bottom trawling when it comes to the seas. And then in generally, it's really assuring these dynamics across the ecosystem. So that can also be illustrated in this way across a landscape that if we should revert the loss of biodiversity in Denmark, recommending to stop bottom trawling, fixing the nutrients problems, restoring lakes and rivers, assuring these natural dynamics across. So in short, we recommend, we know in general what it takes, but we also know basically the general principles of how to prioritize this. So it really matters where we are trying to improve nature. So we need to to prioritize areas where they have the highest realized biodiversity, but also the highest biodiversity potential, and areas where we can connect large areas, but they're complementary for biodiversity in general and represent biodiversity sort of across all organisms. And this matters when we then afterwards maybe have to talk about the green tripod, because if we make a lot of small areas, they will not really contribute. So we need to think of that when we do something for biodiversity. If we want to revert the loss, we need to protect, restore, and establish where it's possible to create large connected areas. Is that then possible in Denmark? Yes, it is. Carsten Rabeck sitting over here, he might have said it to you already yesterday, but they and Anders down here have made this report on where can we create large connected areas that is bigger than 500 hectares. It's a report from the Danish, from also Aarhus University, which have looked into also whether it's possible to do 30% areas in Denmark, and the Biodiversity Council also did an analysis of where is it possible to create these 30% protected areas. This year, the Biodiversity Council then combined all this analysis, looked at synergies. Where is it, how much does these different analyses actually agree? And there's a big agreement, and this is the resulting map you see here in all the green. You have basically the areas, if biodiversity in Denmark should be protected and the means should be efficiently implemented, we need to focus on these areas. That's where we have the highest biodiversity potential and the highest realized biodiversity. But this is, of course, just a suggestion for where these areas could be. There is not a goal of 30% protected nature. And we have done different analysis with that, and there is these very big areas that comes from these different reports that count to 16% and 20% in the other areas. And then actually in the council, we are not only focusing on areas within the 30%, but also the whole landscape planning as in target 1, which is about basically conserving areas also outside these potential future protected areas. But it's very important to keep the focus on that. If we want to change and revert the loss, we have to we need these large protected areas. While a lot of the things we are doing, they are out here. We increase, we protect, we basically create new nature across the 70% of the land, and that will not revert the loss of that. So I often get the question, what about the rivers and lakes? Because we basically put a focus on these 30%. How well do they actually cover the rivers and lakes? And that we have done a recent analysis about. So this is about 1,000 lakes, which are the VP3 lakes. Those of you who are Danish know that, but that's basically those that the ministry is trying to follow up on to which degree we are fulfilling the water directives. And this is then all lakes. When we look at these lakes, most of them are within these 30% I just showed you. And also the catchment are to a larger degree within. But if we look at all lakes, which is basically what needs to be fulfilled when it comes to the water directive, it is in area also quite a proportion, but a smaller part of the catchment. And this is for the rivers, and this is calculated in kilometers of all rivers in Denmark, which are within these 30%. So it's just to say that when we do the aerial protection, we will cover some of these rivers and lakes, but we will not necessarily fix the problems at all. So that's something to keep in mind. At seas, we have up to a bit 31% of protected areas on paper. And this is in gray here. But it's actually not certain that they are placed the best way to complementarily protect the marine life. So this is something that really needs to keep in mind when we designate protected areas, and we are putting in focus on that. So So how well are we then doing in Denmark? How much is actually protected now? I know Carsten also presented these results for you yesterday, but it's about 2% of the mean areas that can be considered protected and contributing towards the European strategy for biodiversity, so the 30% goal. But Denmark have reported 29%. If we look at land, it's also about 2%, and Denmark have reported almost 15%. So why is this? Why is there this huge discrepancy? That relates to what we are doing within these areas designated for protection. So to take the Natura 2000 network that many of you most likely know, within the Natura 2000 networks in Denmark, there is 23% of the areas that is actually under regular agricultural production, and this part is area under production. If we look across Europe, so this is the European countries, and this is the amount of farmland within these areas. You see Denmark is down here on the top. This is the official number from the EU, and this is how the other countries are distributed across. And here we have Holland as an example. And here, this is the favorable conservation status within our Natura 2000 areas, and Denmark is second last. And Denmark is also last when it comes to how much of Denmark's area in total is actually Natura 2000 areas. What have we else been working on in the Biodiversity Council? It is, of course, extremely important to try to understand what is a protected area, what is a strictly protected area. We're taking the basis in the European guidelines and define this, and Carsten will, I think, go much more into detail with that. So this is just to say we have basically, there is definitions, and they are out there, and we have then tried to work here schematically, what does that then mean for what can happen within these areas when it talks about strictly protected and protected areas. So we have the 30 by 30 goals in terms of area protection, but there's also goals in terms of restoration. So what does the European restoration law mean in Denmark? So what we had done here in the Biodiversity Council is taking all these appendixes as follows in relation to the restoration law and looked into what does they actually say about how much of Denmark's area are we expected to restore in relation to these targets. So the overall target is that as 20% of European land and seas that would be under an effective restoration measure in 2030. And then we have these national targets for 2030, 40, and 50, which is then focused on restoring that part of the ecosystem which are in a non-good or in an unknown status by now. So there's not a lot in good conditions. We knew that. It goes both for the seas and for the land. And by 2030, Denmark have then to have put in place effective restoration measures on 6%, and that then increases up to 70% in 2050, and it's about 15% for the seas. So this is a lot of goals, and you also heard before that Denmark have done a very poor job in actually making a national action plan to how do we try to fulfill all these goals in Denmark, not following the guidelines as we also heard before. And the Biodiversity Council have recommended that Denmark gets a national biodiversity law, which is a frame law, you can say, so in rammelov. It's not basically individual laws, it's not touching the individual laws that is currently regulating forest or marine or the different specific ecosystems. But it's a frame law that is setting the goals and the targets for where we want to be. And then the politicians, it needs each year to basically present how well are we doing, what are the measures taking, and there's an external body that is then evaluating if the measures are sufficient and how far they actually are, and then that has to be revised, so the measures have to be revised on a yearly frame and the goals have to be set on a frame. So the Biodiversity Council, we have suggested that this law, we have suggested that the definitions, they need obviously to have some biological realism, so that when we protect, they actually also protect nature. Otherwise, it simply doesn't make sense. And they can't count towards protection. And we have suggested different goals. So what we have done here in Denmark is we have looked into all these different international laws, and basically, based on that, suggested specific goals and targets for Denmark for biodiversity protection, restoration, and the reduction of general pressure on land. In addition, we have recently worked on how much will that then cost if we now want to protect 30% of Denmark's areas. That needs taking out a lot of land of production. It's also doing other measures across the farmland to fix the nitrogen leaching. For the terrestrial area, we need more restoration. For the lakes and rivers, we need to remove the phosphorus in the lakes. We need also to make sure that the rivers are flowing freely. And this is then, and then we have calculated how much does it cost if we stop fisheries in protected areas. So in total, that is between 4.2 and 0.6 billions a year to basically restore and protect Danish ecosystem and make a substantial step towards reverting the loss of biodiversity. How well are we then currently doing? How well are we actually using our current financing goes into biodiversity, used for environment and climate in general? We have been looking into that. So we took all the different current incentive structures for about 9 billion a year, and part of them have basically an aim to contribute to climate, environment, or biodiversity, and these don't, but these do. And of those, we have evaluated how many of them are then efficient. And this is those that we actually think contribute, actually will make a difference. They are inefficient either because it's really unclear if they will make a difference. That really requires that they are put in place the right places, but also that they're implemented in a way that they can contribute. And then some here that has no effect. And then of everything else, part of those have a negative impact on biodiversity. So, and there's a lot of money lacking, even though it basically doesn't cost a lot. There's still a big financing gap between the money needed and the money we have. So can the private sector just easily help fixing this problem? They can definitely contribute, but it's not an easy fix. We did this report in June, and this is just to provide you an examples of some of what we did here was basically trying sort of to illustrate some of the challenges related to increasing private financing, if that should actually matter. Because what will matter is philanthropic additional contribution. They can contribute to revert the loss. But when we talk about just minimizing the general impact and reducing the pressure on nature, and also compensating, even if it's a net positive compensation, it will help, but it will most likely only stop or break the speed at which we are losing species. So we really need to assure that there's mechanisms for a bigger contribution. So this puts, of course, a focus on that there needs to come much more also from the states in terms of fixing this problem. So just to end, if we should revert the loss of biodiversity in Denmark, we basically know what we should be doing, but we need to make it happen, and we need to be sure that there's a continuous direction and we're actually taking steps in the right direction, which is not always the case at the moment, and money are not always used the best way. So that's why we need this national biodiversity law. We need to prioritize the right means in the right places. And then we need a comprehensive plan for Denmark so that we are sure that where there are synergies among these different challenges, climate, water, biodiversity, we are prioritizing those areas, but not compromising biodiversity. And there needs to be a fast and targeted implementation. And that is really a big worry that it will not be fast enough. And more and better financing is needed. Thank you.